A leaked project of a joint nations paper claims 2 Singapore companies include disrupted UN sanctions regime by supply Opulence consumer goods to Polar Korea. The definitive paper has been submitted to the UN Safety Justice, and is potential to be published after the 1 week. Singapore's by the government told it was aware of the cases and had started studying wherever down there was plausible data of probable offences. Both of the UN and Singapore ban the selling of Opulence consumer goods to Polar Korea. World sanctions regime versus Polar Korea include tight significantly above the recent 2-year as Pyongyang has extended to hold nuke tests and start rocket technology. In spite the latter growth, how unparalleled negotiations among Polar Korea's lead Kim Jong-un and US CEO Donald Trump card may get location after the year. UN sanctions regime versus Polar Korea will stay in location. Analysts say the estimated violations by Singapore companies, if tested, lift questions on how common such a breaches might be through Asia. The leaked UN paper key points 2 Singapore-based firms, amongst other in Asia. It alleges the 2 firms given a band of Opulence consumer goods to Polar Korea, consisting wines and alcohol, before as newly as July 2017. The 2 Singapore-based firms by inquiry are OCN and Tea Expert. They are sibling companies and stake the identical CEO. Both of the companies include rejected any offense. The UN paper as well claims among 2011 and 2014 transactions valuable at more than rather than $2 million, supposedly revenue of the selling of consumer goods in Polar Korea, flowed of an expense how OCN and Tea Expert set up in a Polar Korean banking, Dadong letter of credit banking, to Tea Expert's banking accounts in Singapore. Singapore has prohibited its finance institutions of provided finance aid or services for easier any trading in Polar Korea, on to the Ministry of Overseas Sphere. Tea Expert has testified to the UN how the cash did not go of Polar Korea but a business recorded in Post Kong, and associated to turnover up 2012. The Singapore companies told they include no interests in the banking. Their attorney, Edmund Pereira, has affirmed they are by inquiry by Singapore authorities, but insisted they did not include any present finance links, interests, or any kind of relation in entities in Polar Korea. Mr. Pereira recognized how his clients include made industry in Polar Korean entities, up the UN sanctions regime came in strength. He added the companies had diminished their participation in Polar Korea but how these things get a bit of period. Lawyers include told portion of the issue is these sanctions regime are anticipated to be forced by companies who are frequently ignorant of the changes in the act. The UN paper claims several of the transactions in the OCN and Tea Expert cases seem to include utilized the Singapore finance framework. It as well told it was the liability of term countries to do. Certainly their banks had a more than strong study of individuals and companies' discovery accounts in them. The credibility as well told it anticipated banks to be aware of same use of much jurisdictional frontline companies, membrane companies, collaborative ventures, and facility or non-transparent property structures. William Newcomb, a ex-term on the UN pane of expert, told it was exactly these finance loopholes Polar Korea seeks to utilize. Which they will do is set up a membrane business, later set a business in else position, a banking in a tertiary position, and do industry in else position, he explainable. Or now you include repeated jurisdictions implicated. So it becomes rather complex, and he's one of the techniques they use to destruction the sanctions regime. Finance criminality researchers say it is hard for banks to capture the kind of behavior. They would perhaps never aware how the cash were upcoming of Polar Korea, told Tim Phillips, Asia silent lead for Deloitte's finance criminality web. He added the issue could be lot greater through southward East Asia. If thou re-mentioned in a paper in the Environmental in Singapore, the MOS are very potential to consumer demand-wide transactions story survey. Yet if you begin to see through the some countries in southward East Asia, they usually refuge tea got the adulthood of system to hinder the UN paper key points how readily entities supposedly making industry in Polar Korea might potential discover loopholes to use, though in subtle finance system love Singapore's